This post was partially inspired by a recent vlog by Kyle Hill about the recent Nobel Prize in Physics. There is a universal speed limit. We call it the speed of light, but there's a certain sense in which that's backwards. Light in a vacuum goes the universal speed limit because that's the speed limit. It is not the speed limit because that's the speed that light goes. Light will actually go slower than light speed under certain conditions, for example through the air or water or things like that. Albert Einstein was able to show that the speed of light isn't just the speed that light goes in a vacuum, though. It's something more fundamental. It's the fastest that two things can gain information about each other. If two things are a certain distance apart, the soonest they can gain information about each other is defined by the speed of light. Einstein was able to demonstrate that, based on his theory of relativity, information passing between objects faster than the speed of light would lead to paradoxes and contradictions. To something moving faster than the speed of light, the order of events would proceed from effect to cause instead of the other way around. That disrupts our understanding of what it means for something to be a cause. This means something I cannot stress enough. Under the theory of relativity, there is no faster than light communication. If something is 1 light second away from a detector, the fastest that information about a state change can reach the deflector is 1 second. And the theory of relativity has accurately predicted gravitational waves, the bending of light, corrections needed for the satellite systems that run our GPS, among many other things. And yet, when observing the way subatomic particles behave, something strange was observed. Particles that were produced in pairs always had opposite properties. If one looked like it was spinning to the left, the other looked like it was spinning to the right. If one went north, the other went south. If one had a positive electric charge, the other had a negative electric charge. Other than them being opposite, though, there wasn't much of a pattern. Something could be produced that was positive, going north, spinning up, and its opposite would be going south, spinning down, and negative. It would be just as likely to be a pair with any other set of properties, though, as long as they were opposite. The idea was proposed that these particles don't have their properties until they interact with other particles. Einstein said this was impossible. Sometimes the distance was far enough that they would have to communicate their properties faster than light to their opposite before it was observed. The information about what they were going to be had to be decided when they were made, and then observed later, Einstein surmised. These qualities must have been held in some kind of hidden variables. Otherwise, causality would be broken. John Bell saw the debate and wrote a paper describing how it is possible to determine if particles have these proposed hidden variables or not. Over time, the evidence that these hidden values aren't set until the particles interact started to build up. In 1972, John Clauser, along with Stuart Friedman, found that his experiments didn't line up with Einstein's theories when he ran light through polarizing filters within a crystal. But this is still kind of local. So then Alain Aspect was able to do a similar experiment at a larger scale in 1982. Finally, Anton Zeilinger used light from opposite ends of the visible universe to test these properties. Ultimately, Bell's inequality would conclusively demonstrate that the impossible is true in all of these cases. Or rather, what seems impossible under relativity is true. Because after all, if the records indicate that what we think is impossible actually happened, that means we were wrong about what's impossible. When you come down to it, what they are saying is that the collection of previously established records of what actually happened combined with logical reasoning overturned our concept of what's possible and what's not. We have another name for the collection of previously established records about what happened: history. There is a common statement that gets thrown around by various historians. It has a few forms. Dr. Bart Ehrman has said, historians can only establish what probably happened in the past, and by definition a miracle is the least probable occurrence. And so, by the very nature of the canons of historical research, we can't claim historically that a miracle probably happened. By definition, it probably didn't. And history can only establish what probably did. There are 2 points at which I disagree with this kind of assertion. I'm only going to go over one of these today, and then I'll get into the other in more detail next week. Besides these two, I also disagree with the contextual definition of a miracle as something that probably did not happen. Using that definition of miracle and applying it to the event under investigation is an exercise in begging the question. But that's not today's topic. The other part of the statement is one place that my objection needs to be nuanced. Absolutely, I agree that historians, while acting as historians, are not the ones to establish that a miracle occurred. In exactly the same way that the historians, called record keepers in this case, were not the ones to determine that quantum particles set their properties at interaction. That isn't the job of the historian, it's the job of his logician, the physicist in the one case and the theologian in the other. If we were to put historians like Bart Ehrman in charge of the data for quantum particle tests while Einstein's theories were reigning, they would have disregarded them. They would have justified this by saying that those tests cannot be admitted because they are saying something that's impossible. To me, that's not the role of a historian. The role of the historian is to tell us what the record says and to sort out where there might be contradictions and discrepancies in the historical record. Those who collect the data, record the data, and then read the data back to us are the wrong ones to decide that what's recorded is impossible. There does come a point when historians have to evaluate sources, but if we start by saying the source is invalid because what it describes is impossible or improbable, then we are putting the cart before the horse. We determine what's possible or probable by evaluating what happened, not the other way around. Would Dr. Ehrman refuse to admit the records of the 2009 Bulgarian lottery, on the grounds that bringing up the same set of lottery numbers 2 times in a row are extremely unlikely? I don't think so. The record shows that it happened, and the fact that it happened is partially how we determine that it is, in fact, possible. To say it's impossible and therefore the record must be wrong is wrong-headed from the start. But there is another side to that approach, and sometimes Christians can fall into a very similar trap. Not everything that gets evaluated in history fits neatly into the typical Christian perspective either. For example, there was the Temple of Serapis in Alexandria where it was claimed that a large image of Serapis hovered in mid-air. We don't know how they did this. There's always the fallback answer that everyone who saw the stone was required to be slightly intoxicated, but there were a few who pushed past that requirement and they never reported that the stone was suspended in any well-documented way. Suggestions have ranged from micro-wires to magnets to get the stone to levitate. I say that we simply don't have the granularity in the historical record to know how they did it. The evidence supports that it really did look like a levitating stone. Perhaps at some point more data will come available to help us determine how. Another fact that seems to fly in the face of the typical Christian perspective is the Tibetan method for finding the next Dalai Lama. The tests are designed to find memories which would come from the previous Dalai Lama, among other things. The evidence that we have seems to indicate that these tests do, in fact, work. I'm not satisfied with the answer that some apologists fall back on, that this is the result of demonic interference. If God really allows this level of evil influence over our perception in spiritual matters, it casts doubt on all of our spiritual perceptions. I'm not saying that it can't be demons. I'm saying that just because it's inconvenient to our traditions, interpretations, and/or understanding doesn't automatically make it demons. We would need more specific information to make that proclamation. I'm not going to fall into the same trap as Dr. Ehrman and say that just because my tradition says reincarnation is impossible then the Dalai Lama can't be partaking in the memories of a dead spiritual leader. Of course, in the case of ancient Egyptian idols and Tibetan spiritual practices, I'm speaking out of my depth. To whatever extent I've gotten the facts wrong, just consider these to be analogies by fiction. The point stands even if the individual cases don't. When we evaluate our data, we need to evaluate the data we have and draw conclusions from that rather than building our conclusions and then molding the data to fit it. To do history the way Dr. Ehrman does and apply that system consistently would lead to accepting hidden variables in particle physics and to simply throw out the known cases that were counter-evidence as fiction.